Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third meeting of the Sol Forum. As always, this space exists to foster serious, elevated, and interdisciplinary conversation about UAP and the questions they raise for science, policy, and philosophy. Today's session is devoted entirely to a single guest, one whose work has shaped our very understanding of what UAP are and how we should do research on them, Dr. Jacques Vallée. Jacques has persistently challenged the idea that UAP, or what he calls the phenomenon, is reducible to something simple, singular, or strictly material. We also have some very exciting news to share. The Sol Foundation's 2025 Symposium will take place this fall from October 24th to 26th in Italy. We'll be announcing details soon, including registration process, speakers, and the event schedule. In the meantime, please visit our website for updates, and you'll find a link for that in the description below. So today we're very, very excited to have Jacques with us. As you know, he's a computer scientist, information scientist, a venture capitalist, and a founding figure in, we could say UAP studies, but really just any kind of research into UAP, and absolutely foundational for our understanding of UAP in general. And we have him here today because he's recently published a book, the sixth volume of a multi-book series called Forbidden Science, which is a chronicle of his research, his encounters with witnesses, his reflection on UAP. And it's also a window into how he developed his thinking as he was going. And so, Jacques, welcome to the Sol Forum. It's really nice to have you here again.
Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to this.
Yeah, it's going to be a great conversation. I know our member audience and other people will see this in the future are really excited to have you. And I'm excited because, the Forbidden Science series is, to me, as a researcher and also just as somebody who is very concerned about UAP, it's a really interesting series of books because it's very rare for someone who's published a lot and done foundational thinking about anything to publish books like this that give you a window into how they came to think what they think. Usually when we read research books or academic work, we discover what the writer thinks, but not how they get to what they think. And these books are very different in that regard. So maybe to start off, you could tell us a bit about, why you chose to do this at all over the last couple decades.
Well, journals are more of a tradition in Europe than they are in the U.S. In the U.S., literature deals with current topics, and in Europe, a number of writers have chosen the format of a diary because they felt they lived through exceptional times. And that was my motivation for starting as a student, as a young astronomer, because I thought, I was living in exceptional times with the end of World War II, the transition to computers, the transition to new approaches to astronomy, which was my first career. What I didn't know was that those exceptional times would last, 70 more years. And I'm still writing, although now I'm thinking of, the closing volume in that whole series. What people will find there is not just, and people occasionally write to me in a friendly way, why don't you stick to, UFOs in your journals? Because there are many things that, why do you need to talk about, that you moved to a new house or that, your kid did something amusing or something like, why do we need to know that? Well, that's the whole point of a diary as opposed to just a chronicle, a historical chronicle. And in the diaries, you find yourself going back to a time when there were no personal computers, a time when there were no satellites in the sky. and when I started writing. And so it's important for people who, this is not for everybody who wants to listen or read something about UFOs or flying saucers. It's really for people who want to understand how things have changed, because they continue to change. And sometimes, people criticize me by saying, why don't you stick to the new things? Why do you want to talk about the old stuff? Well, the old stuff, and we keep rediscovering the old stuff because it's very much in the research we do. And I'm amused, and that's my last comment on that. I'm amused when in Washington when they say, Roe is only going to look at the data from the last year, um, because there is too much of the other stuff. And anyway, we're only interested in what's making an impact now. Well, the things that happened 25 years ago are making an impact now. And if we ignore them, it would be like an astronomer saying, I'm only going to look at new comets. We don't care about what Kepler did in the 16th century. Well, the comet that Kepler saw in the 16th century is coming back, every 50 or 60 odd years. And without it, there were a lot of things we wouldn't know about the solar system. So we do need to keep track of things, and doing it through the continuing observations of a scientist who's been involved since the beginning with the different personalities moving across the screen can be useful as part of a total assessment. So that's what I do.
Okay, fantastic answer, and it gives us a lot of insight into why to read these books. And I would advocate for people to take them seriously as much as your more famous works. So I think to go into the book, I have a question for you, which is how have things changed in research and inquiry into UAP and our understanding of them, and how have they stayed the same? I ask you that because you provide a window into what was happening in the background in the BAS group, the OSAP group, and what came after. You call the group the Lone Stars in the book, which I think is a euphemism. But you give us a window into those conversations, and what I see there is that um, it shows that there's not as much consensus as people think, even among the best researchers.
The first interest, official interest, and scientific interest in the subject just came from having all these reports from both from military people, but mostly from civilians who were exposed to the phenomenon. And the response was generally skeptical, but there was a feeling that we cannot ignore those reports because frankly, because um, the feeling of danger in international relations. There could be something going on that would be a threat. And that that was not so much the case in Europe. I think in Europe the reaction was always one of curiosity, and scientific interest in a new report, because that's where science is made. But in the U.S., everything tends to be interpreted as a threat to the stability of the country and so on. And that's very much a cultural reaction. So that precipitated as you know, a number of classified studies, and then the Air Force with Project Blue Book, which lasted almost 20 years. The Blue Book was not classified, contrary to some of the things we still see in the press, and it it at the beginning it was just eliminating one case after the other to give people the feeling that nothing was hidden, nothing was classified. You can report this, although pilots did not report. Um, but the population reported, and there were radar data. There were that kind of thing. So that triggered a controversy within the scientific community as to the relevance of that. And the Air Force felt that they had other things to do. I mean, you join the Air Force to fly, the fastest, best planes you can find, and you don't want to be stuck in an office going through files, one after the other of somebody seeing a light at night. I mean, who cares? And the uh, the Air Force finally created or led to the creation of a study at the University of Colorado, um, led by Professor Condon, who was a distinguished physicist of the Oppenheimer generation. And after 2 years, they concluded that in fact there was no implied threat in the phenomenon. And although they did not explain all the cases they had looked at, but that generally they thought, and that's almost an exact quote, that science would not be advanced by investing more people and more money into the study of UFOs, which people understood to mean go home, there's nothing there. And it killed the research for over 10 years, probably 15 years. Um, Fortunately, there were people like me who had other income. I mean, I had professional commitments in technology and then in the financing of advanced technology. And it's a credit to the people who invested in the venture funds that I ran with a small team of people that they knew. I mean, I never thought of hiding the fact that I was spending my own time, studying UFOs. And in Silicon Valley, people thought that it was important to do that. So I was in fact supported by many of the people who invested in my funds, including the fund by NASA. So I had the privilege of having access to um, I had no real secret access to anything except in very, very specific areas. But but that was not relevant. I mean, most of the data came from people who had seen something and were reporting it openly, including cops, including university professors, and including farmers. The farmers were probably the best because they knew their territory very well and they could see when when animals reacted to certain things. And there were traces. You could go to those places, which I did, with people who had experience with vegetation, with animals, with all that. And then Mr. Bigelow became interested, and I was part of the first approach with NIDS. And when the team bought the ranch, when Mr. Bigelow bought that ranch um, in Utah, and we looked all over Utah and Nevada deeply for recurrent cases, and as you know, people still are active with those properties where things seem to continue happening. So that's that's what brought us here. And then, as you know, the Defense Intelligence Agency took an interest in what was going on at the Bigelow Ranch and funded a study that I was part of called BAS, Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Systems. And my responsibility there, along with Dr. Puthoff, Dr. Keller, and many others, uh, all of us uh, at, at in that particular study, having classified access at the top secret level for the duration of the study. And my particular assignment was the building of a database, which has been partially, you know, not it has not been declassified, and I understand why. Um, but it covers 240,000 cases all over the world, so it's not really a database. It's what's called a data warehouse with 13 or 14 different databases that we reduced all to English to a common structure. That structure was going to feed into an artificial intelligence system that would have two purposes. The first one would be to refine it, because nobody needs 240,000 cases to know that there is some sort of a phenomenon happening. We need, if we had 20,000 of the best ones, we could turn that over to the scientific community in different different disciplines, from medicine to chemistry to architect to agriculture and everything else. And based on that, there would be a number of teams could feed from that. That was the idea. It was not done because we were cut off after 2 years, and I really don't know the current disposition of what we did. So at that point, the project terminated, and I I should make it clear I don't have any secret clearance or particular access, outside of that study. So
So,
right now
so
I have no clearance.
okay. So you gave us a lot there that I'll unpack over the course of the conversation. One thing that you said, which I think is a very important point, is that um, the focus on a possible threat or national security threat is a very narrow lens through which to view UAP. And yet, very interestingly, at the beginning of your new book, you start out by giving a couple dozen pages to some events in Southern California that suggest something like a threat, or at least injury and maybe violence. And you had said to me before this that you thought these were very important events, and you've been struck by the fact that in over about a dozen interviews, no one had asked you about them. So maybe you could say a word about those.
It, it's I understand why people didn't spend time on that, because they there are some current questions that people want to ask about, and they rush into those standard questions. Um, there are several things in this book that are not mentioned anywhere else, which are things um, that I made an effort to go and explore, because I had heard, or somebody had contacted me about some exceptional cases that were affecting them in their lives. And those were not reported anywhere. And a number of researchers, or my colleagues, and will tell you that there is a lot that people are not reporting to the media at all, either because they affect their property, their cattle, if they are farmers, and or ranchers, uh, and the reputation of their family, or their reputation in business. I have CEOs of Silicon Valley companies who have said, Jacques, can we have coffee together, because I'd like you to know about something that that I saw, on a weekend with my family. And by the way, you can't report it. And those are precious. And this came from a family who lives in the Mojave, away from Los Angeles, and in an area which is the playground of the major aerospace companies. So it's a very often a testing ground for new things, and they love to see new aircraft and new prototypes. Those are not necessarily, I mean, they may be classified because of their performance, but I mean, you're going to see them because those prototypes can be seen over a wide area. Um, the the particular case involved something very strange. It involved discs, just like what people are reporting now as drones, except that didn't have propellers. They were large discs, about 10 to 12 feet as far as they could tell, that appeared in the sky, and they seemed to exchange light light rays, or light flashes, but it was most of the time it was mostly like a laser between one disk and another. And they thought that this may be some new weapon that was being developed. And they started in the late 70s. Now, I learned of it after 2010, 2012, but that had been going on for a long time. And when one disk was hit by the beam, the disk would vanish, um, which is reminiscent of some of the things around the Nimitz and more recently that everybody has known about. It would vanish, but it would reappear somewhere else. And there were sort of structured dances among these objects. Um, this happened in the evening and at night, and I go into it at some. I went there several times, met with the people, met with their families, and recalled, what they had seen. The recollection was very interesting because they do not all remember the same things, which is, any investigator will tell you that's a classic in multiple witness cases. People are not going to tell the same story, but we could reconstruct from where they were the total observation. Um, in daylight, when they came to the site, there was a truck there with what they first interpreted as a dead body there, which may have been maybe a decoy or something else. But there was somebody someone had set fire to the truck, and there was a man there who was in a uniform and told them to go home and that there was nothing to see. But that was at the place where those beams had been exchanged at night. So they got very scared and did not report anything. And it only came out because I happened to know somebody in that family who led me to the site. It happens that in my computer files, of course, something like that happens, I'm going to go back to the computer and see if there is anything similar or relevant that happened in that time. Was a very interesting professional from Hollywood who is a high technology um, a consultant to the studios for special effects. So he has his own company that develops special effects for Hollywood, but he was also recruited by the NSA, National Security Agency, to go into the desert, into the same area of the Mojave, and this would have been in the late in the mid to late 80s, uh, to expose, and they would give him a particular set of coordinates where something would happen in orbit that they wanted him to photograph with a very, very high special infrared film. That and that, as you may know, it takes a lot of experience to deal professionally with infrared film, especially at the very, very high response index. And that was his special team. That was why he was recruited. There were other teams like that. And he learned that in one other team, the truck had caught fire and both of the agents from NSA had been killed. So at that point, he resigned and went back to Hollywood. And uh, I knew him because he was involved in some research that Dr. Hynek and I did in Hollywood in a special case where he had recorded some of the effects of the phenomenon of another phenomenon. So when I went back to talk to him about the cases in the desert, he told me the whole story, and he said that he just couldn't continue to work. He had a family and didn't want to be exposed to that. But you have two cases involving very strange things in the sky, involving the intelligence community and the satellite community back in the 70s and 80s, with things that resulted in the death of some of the people involved in the sightings. And
So, okay.
so I had no way to investigate further, and I just recorded the information, and it's in the book.
Okay, so those are remarkable cases, I'm going to ask you to relate them in a second to one of your core ideas, which is to summarize it, is that UAP aren't what we think they are. That they're a kind of system that's in communication with us and is trying to, according to you, instruct us or condition us to educate us in a sense, so that we become different by virtue of experiencing them. And you say that UAP may be a kind of one system of communication of a broader meta system. And I think by that you mean that the system of communication or symbols changes over time, and it changes in response to human thought. So a member of Sol, her name is Orianda, um, raised the question of, do you see new evidence for this hypothesis, such as these cases, and has it suggested this evidence that maybe the system is dealing with us differently?
So that results from discussions I had actually back in France. I mean, from the beginning, when I started building the databases based on French cases and cases in Europe, not American cases, especially, although there were a few that had been published in the books by Donald Kehoe, Ruppelt, and some others. And discussing it with people in the Sorbonne and people in French universities, that idea of, is it a control system, came up, and that's the question that any scientist should ask. I mean, what is it? I mean, we don't have one or two or 10 or 20 or 100 cases. We have many thousands, dozens of thousands of cases. So it's doing something. It's not hiding. It's in fact in full view. There are many cases where somebody is driving on the highway and something lands in front of the car. Okay, so this is not somebody hiding. This is very much in your face. And The idea that out of our conversations came that, is it a control system? But people have misunderstood what I meant by that. As you know, I've published it in my my books in the 80s and so on. I've continued to work on it because that's one of the things that a good computer AI study could give us an answer to. Okay, so that's what one of the purposes of bringing AI into it from the beginning. Now, a control system is not necessarily something that humans are designing. Um, like a set of signals on the roads is a control system. We have, green lights and red lights, and we have different signals that tell you how to drive around and so on. And that's a control system. We have lots of things around us. A university is a control system. Um, you don't necessarily know the rules. You have to discover the rules. You know, I certainly remember as a PhD student, what does it mean to become a doctor in science? Okay. How do you do it? Well, there is no recipe. There is nothing that says if you take this course and you pass them, then you become a doctor. That's not true. You have to find an environment, you have to find a subject, you have to design new research and so on. So there are a number of things around us that are control systems that we take for granted. Um, the Jacques Bergier, who was an extraordinary French um, philosopher and writer and publisher, and during World War II had been a spy, as one of the first scientific spies of our time. He was looking for, heavy water. And was looking for the source, the place where the V2 rockets were being built, and was one of the spies that located Peenemünde. And so he had been he told me, a concentration camp is a control system. I mean, it's like a prison. There is a fence. You cannot go out. If you try to get out, you will be killed. But and as you may know, he was captured by the Germans. He was tortured a number of times, and was very lucky to finally survive World War II. And he had survived with a fairly amazing sense of humor that had helped him keep his intelligence and his mind through what he suffered. And um, he said in the camp where he was interned, one of them, Mauthausen, one time they were astonished to see that the SS, the Germans, were bringing in the firemen from Munich. The firemen from Munich had decided to go on strike in the middle of World War II, and the Germans didn't like them, and they arrested them and put them in a concentration camp with the French prisoners and American prisoners, and they kept them there for 3 weeks, and then they released them. And he said that's when I understood that a concentration camp could be a university, that you would go there without knowing why, and you would learn something, and then you may or may not come out, or you may or may not be killed, or you may or may not be burned to death. And the system will control that. Okay, so so he said the question you have to ask about UFOs is it, number one, is it a natural system or an artificial system? control system. And if it is a control system, is it open or closed? In other words, are we being taken over by a species from somewhere in space that's vastly more intelligent than we are? As Dr. Nolan says, people who have had 10, scientific revolutions or 100 or 1,000 and come here with superior science to do something. And in which case, it's a closed system. We're like prisoners. I mean, something is going to happen to us, and there is very little we can do. Or is it an open system where we can, in fact, communicate with it? And if we can communicate with it, then the question for me as an information scientist is what are the modalities of the interaction? It's not just can we learn their language and they say, we come in peace to save mankind or something like, or we will give you, the cure for cancer or something. I don't think it's at that level. I think it's a meta system. It's not a system. And that's my fear. If we can circle back to your earlier question about, about NIDS and about BAS, what we did for the government and what we did for the Defense Intelligence Agency, half of the budget was spent developing, a super database. And we don't know where it went. I mean, I'm not clear to know where it went. But that would be a very interesting question, because the people who are getting it are getting raw data, which we have very well organized, all in English. So they have the luxury of, we had 5 translators from French, English, Portuguese, Russian, everything was translated in a single structure across 14 databases. That's what we need to answer the question about the control system. And it's not being done.
Right,
And
right.
we
That's very
hired
that
a whole
that's
team that we had trained to work on it.
yes, that's
They're
very,
gone.
very clear, Jacques, that
So to rebuild that will take the next 10 or 15 years. And nobody says that to Congress, and I think Congress should hear it, because it's
so
our money.
so Jacques, sorry to interrupt you, but you've said so much that I want people to appreciate that you've said something very profound, and I want us to explore this. In
Well,
fact,
but you can start with a technical question, and
uh,
it gets,
yeah,
when you ask, is it a control system? That's a big question.
I know it's a big question, but a lot of our members ask questions about the control system, and they keyed into something very significant you said. Before going to the next question, though, I want to reiterate something you said, because I think it'll help the conversation and help people understand you. Um, you asked at one point whether the system is open or closed, and and you said additionally, I believe if it's open, that it would be possible to communicate back to it. And it sounds to me like that's the key question for you, is if you can understand what the system of symbols is, or the modalities of communication, then you can understand enough to engage in some kind of communication, or at least give some kind of response to show that you
Yes.
understand. So then the question, and we have a member named Jacqueline who has asked this, is could the system be stimulating us? Provided there is such a system, could it be stimulating us to interact with it more as subjects or agents than as something like animals or objects? Is it looking for us to try to interact with it as equals or with parity?
Well, um, what I saw in the note you gave me is she was also asking, is it a control system because we think it is? And that's a very interesting question, because we react to the UFO phenomenon or the UAP phenomenon. And at this point, when I think about what I'm going to do next in this research, if I'm given the opportunity to to live a little longer, I'm not going to go back and write any more computer programs. There are better people to do that now. They have the data, and we're in a different phase now. We're in a whole different system. I have the luxury of doing some experiments I wanted to do for a long time. So if you think you are inside the control system, there are things that you can do, or if you think you're inside a simulation, which was a new concept that I initially rejected, and then Reiswerk and others have brought it back to the forefront, and we have to ask that at the same time. Can we test it? How would you test it? Well, if I'm here in my apartment, and the temperature is constant in this apartment, and so this could, but outside I can see it's cold, or I can see it's the sun is out and it's warm, and how come it's constant here? So this would lead me to think that there is a control system, namely a thermostat, that is somewhere. So I can start looking around the walls, and if I see a dial, I can turn it, or I could start a fire and see what happens. See if the temperature changes. If the temperature doesn't change, then I know I'm inside a control system. So we can do the same thing with UFOs, but we have to react. We have to, number one, acknowledge that it exists, and number two, we have to react to it. So um, I one of the things I did about 20 years ago is we were looking for a place in the country where I could keep books and we could spend time, with our kids who were young at the time and so on. And so we bought a property in the redwoods in Northern California, not far from the place where this Nobel Prize in biology had that meeting with the raccoon, who essentially desensitized his brain, um, and engaged in a dialogue with him. And we live, about an hour from there in the redwoods. And I built an observatory there, a small observatory with a library and a bedroom and a workroom and a dome on top with a telescope. And I thought, we're over half a mile from the nearest neighbor. It's completely dark at night. The sky is completely open, and this could be a signal that could be interesting to the phenomenon. So the phenomenon could manifest there, and we would be the only witnesses, but we could record something. And nothing happened. Nothing happened until the very last day, and I mentioned that in the book, in this book, in number 6. We sold the property. Our kids were grown up by then. We wanted to go back to the city, and I was at work in the city, and my wife was taking the last couple of things out of the property. Everything had been cleaned up. We sold it to our neighbors, who were wonderful people running a winery in Mendocino County. So in the middle of the night, there was such a bright light that woke her up, and there were no curtains anymore. There was nothing on the windows. There was a light that brightened up the whole forest. It was intense white, tending to the ultra violet, the blue and purple, and um, it was a large condensation center with again the light all over, but going down the dirt driveway in front of the ranch that went to the small road down the valley. And she saw this and then told me about it. And it was like something very much alive saying goodbye. And that, you know, there is a sense of humor in all the manifestations of UFOs, a sense of humor at a level which is difficult for us to accept because we have very little opportunity to respond. It will choose its own time. It will choose the most unusual. I mean, they have that in Nevada and in Utah at the Utah ranch. Uh, Things that happen all of a sudden and right in front of you, in front of your car, and um, with that element of surprise and sometimes that element of humor, which is I think indicative of uh, of a system that's at a different level from us, but that understands humor, which is, I find that encouraging. If at least we have that in common with them. Now, many animals understand humor. Um, Certainly apes do. Certainly dolphins do, and many of the higher, the higher animals have a sense of humor that they can share with us. The people training, you know, the higher uh, um, uh, animals, and both in circus and in nature will tell you that, including lions or including, and those uh, those are essential throughout life. So to see those reactions from which are hard. I mean, why didn't that light manifest when we were there with the telescope and with all the scientific instruments we had in the tower?
Yes, it's a bit
It
Jacques,
was
as if it
solid.
it's a
So it
bit
will
as if it
choose its
winked
own
at you.
time, but we have to pay attention to those moments because those are the moments that could initiate communication that would be meaningful communication.
It's a bit as if a bit as if the system winked at you.
Well, if you think that we are in a control system, what you need to do is disturb it. You can disturb, uh, the environment system by lighting a fire, or by changing a dial, and then observe what happens. So we have to think of experiments we can do to disturb the UFO or UAP phenomenon, not just observe it and document it.
Wow. Jacques, this is extraordinary, and I want to say this before we go to our break. Is I think people don't often appreciate this about your thinking. Is that this isn't philosophical speculation for you. It's a scientific hypothesis that you hold as an information scientist, and you're saying if I'm right about this hypothesis, then certain acts that would be disturbing to the system will allow me to test whether it's there and to understand it better. Which is really, if we think of you as a scientist, it's a very very remarkable point. So as we go to the second half of the show, I think we'll explore what the practical value of that idea is for people. So we're going to go to a break now. And before we get to the second half of the show, we're going to hear from Mark van Rennenkamp, our colleague, and who provides for us monthly something we call the Sol Briefing. Thanks for being there, everyone.
Hello and welcome to the May 2025 edition of the Sol Briefing. I'm Mark van Rennenkamp. On May 1st, the UAP Disclosure Fund hosted an unprecedented day-long event on Capitol Hill focused on UAP, or Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena. The event, which was co-hosted by the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, featured presentations and discussions by scientists, national security officials, members of Congress, and former congressional staffers who focused extensively on the UAP topic behind the scenes. In comments during the event, Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, the chair of the House Task Force on the Declassification of Federal Secrets, stated that 2 UAP-focused hearings are in the works. The first would be, quote, government-focused and feature, quote, appointees, which we assume are Trump administration appointees, and the other would feature, quote, military and or former military members. According to Luna, one witness, quote, wants to come forward in regards to a crash retrieval program, end quote. Additionally, in comments to congressional reporter Matt Laszlo on April 29th, Luna stated that the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, quote, has been extremely helpful, end quote, in Congress's investigation. Watch this space, we certainly will. In a 3-part interview with investigative journalists George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell, Matthew Brown, the author of an explosive report presented and read into the congressional record during a November hearing, finally spoke out. According to Brown, a secretive government special access program dubbed Immaculate Constellation isolates and suppresses high-quality imagery, video, and other data of unidentified anomalous phenomena. In essence, keeping such data outside of normal military and intelligence reporting channels. Brown also alleges that he read transcripts of the former director of the government's UAP Analysis Office, AARO, briefing key members of the Senate Intelligence Committee. According to Brown, then Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee and current Secretary of State and acting National Security Advisor Marco Rubio asked, what the hell is the executive branch doing? Have they been running this for 60 years without congressional oversight? End quote. An apparent reference to unreported, secretive UAP programs and activities managed or overseen by the U.S. government. Now, Rubio's alleged comments echo comments that he made in June 2023 to News Nation, where he stated, quote, Congress has been paying for it and probably for a long time, end quote. On May 13th, former intelligence official and UAP whistleblower David Grush met with the Pentagon's UAP Analysis Office, AARO, in a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, which is a room where classified discussions can take place. Congressional reporter Matt Laszlo broke the story, which is a significant one because AARO is congressionally mandated. It is required to investigate the kinds of allegations that Grush made under oath in a July 2023 House Oversight Committee hearing. During the hearing, Grush testified that the U.S. government has operated, managed, overseen a decades-long UAP retrieval and reverse engineering program or effort. Importantly, the Inspector General of the intelligence community deemed Grush's allegation that information was inappropriately concealed from Congress to be, quote, credible and urgent, end quote. That designation triggered mandatory notifications to the congressional intelligence committees. Watch this space, we certainly will be. In a new paper published on May 12th by the Sol Foundation, retired Army Colonel Carl Nell, who also served in key technology-focused positions at major corporations and defense contractors, argues compellingly for the reintroduction and passage of the UAP Disclosure Act. First introduced by then Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senator Mike Rounds in 2023, the Disclosure Act would establish a blue ribbon panel of experts from various fields who would review and recommend for release records, documents, and other information related to UAP, which allegedly has been withheld from the American public for several decades. Now, the legislation is arguably the most extraordinary ever introduced in Congress. Among other provisions and definitions, it defines, quote, non-human intelligence and refers to it 24 times. Remarkably, the legislation would also require the U.S. government to assert eminent domain, to take control of, quote, all recovered technologies of unknown origin and biological evidence of non-human intelligence that may be controlled by private persons or entities, a clear nod to long-standing rumors that recovered UAP materials and craft have been transferred to private defense contractors to evade transparency provisions. On May 9th, the Pentagon's UAP Analysis Office, AARO, released a new UAP video. The 8-minute footage, which was recorded in infrared by a U.S. military drone somewhere over the Middle East in 2023, appears to show an object moving at a high rate of speed, despite apparently lacking wings or any discernible or obvious means of propulsion, such as a jet engine or propellers. Now, according to AARO, quote, the available data does not support a conclusive analytic evaluation, end quote. Behind that somewhat tortured bureaucratic language appears to be an admission that the government, the Pentagon, is stumped by this incident. Now, loyal Soul Briefing viewers will remember that the Pentagon's key UFO hunter, Dr. John Kozlowski, the director of AARO, has stated repeatedly in the past that his office is stumped by, quote, true anomalies, end quote. Kozlowski stated in November that, quote, there are interesting cases that I, with my physics and engineering background and time in the intelligence community, I do not understand. And I don't know anybody else who understands them either, end quote. According to Kozlowski, quote, we're going to need the help of academia and the public to address some of these, end quote. And in March comments to Scientific American, Kozlowski stated, quote, we do have some events in our holdings that are really peculiar, and I don't know yet what's behind those, end quote. So while we applaud AARO's transparency, the redactions in the video make independent analysis impossible. AARO still has some work to do, but congratulations on this seemingly watershed moment in UAP disclosure.
Hi, welcome back, everyone, to our conversation with Jacques Vallée. So, Jacques, we want to jump in now, I think, to a question that follows up on your very lucid and helpful explanation of your idea of the control system, which is, I'll put the question this way. Do you think that the system has an interest of its own in not exposing itself? And what I mean is that we know that UAP are very elusive. They may display themselves, but they're still hard to find. They're still hard to detect. As happened with you when you tried to provoke the system, it didn't respond until the very last minute. Could this be defensive behavior? Is it somehow an intrinsic property of the system? Or is this simply it being interactive?
I can only tell you what it seems to me, what it feels like to me, having lived through, all those years, and my professors were the witnesses, were truck drivers and farmers and people who told me about what they had seen. Um, there is one case in France that I like to quote. It happened, in the very early in the late 50s. A man who was going to his work. He was a night watchman. He was going through his work through a forest, through a clearing in a wood at 2 o'clock in the morning, and there is a man in front of him and a disc sitting in the clearing. So he stops, and the man is holding, something in his hand pointed at him, and he's afraid that that's a gun, and so he freezes. And this is a man again in a uniform, no signs, no insignia, and he says, "Am I in Germany or Italy?" Which is stupid because, for one thing, there is Switzerland in between, Germany and Italy, and furthermore, he's in Alsace, he's in France. So the man, the night watchman, says, "No, you're in France." And he says, "What time is it?" And the man looks at his watch and says, "It's 2:30." And the man out of the disc says, "You lie, it's 4 o'clock." Well, it was 2:30. So he goes back behind the disc. Presumably he goes into the disc, but we don't know that. And the disc takes off and goes up in the sky. And that's the first indication for the witness that this was not just, some pilot who had lost his way. This was something else. You tell that story, everybody is going to laugh, and I think that story was quoted to show how stupid witnesses were, and that he must have been still asleep and making up all that. Take it to the next level. 2 questions, 2 answers. The 2 answers are, "You're wrong." You're not in Alsace, and it's not 2:30. Even though you are in Alsace and it is 2:30. I think to me that sums up the whole phenomenon. What it's saying is you don't know how to think about where you are and what time it is, because space and time are irrelevant. And that's now when I talk to Eric Davis, Dr. Davis, who is my number one resource in theoretical physics these days. He says, that's right. I mean, time and space are not considered as primary quantities in modern physics. They are secondary things that we can measure and we experience in our lives, but the physical phenomena go on at a different level in the form, in the quantum form, and so on, and that's where he loses me most of the time. So we have to be very, very, very careful about the structure of those things, and we have to take out our reaction to it. I mean, I'm delighted to know that Congress is going to pay attention to pilots who have these pictures of things that move around. Now, there is a French pilot, in the late 70s, was, flying or 80, flying a Mirage, who has spoken on the record on French television, and I can, we know his name, and I can find the film. He was flying home to Dijon, to his base. He didn't have any armament on his aircraft. His aircraft was a high-end um, fighter, a Mirage, and he saw a light ahead of him, just like what was just said about presenting it to Congress. This happened many years ago. In another century, he sees this bright light. He is intrigued by the light because there is nothing on radar at that particular place, and then the thing is going around him at a very high rate of speed, making a wide curve. He does a little calculation in his head, and he says the g-forces would be beyond what any human pilot would tolerate. So this, I think the exact time was 78. Um, and the thing places itself on his tail, which is of course the kill position in, aerial fight. He doesn't like that, so he puts his jet into a dive, which is difficult because he wasn't prepared to do that. He was just going home, returning the plane. And the thing circles back, comes back in front of him, and it circles around and goes on his tail a second time in the kill position again. So whatever it is understands the kill position. He dives again, and the thing goes off. This is seen from the ground by a gendarme who reports it, which is the only reason we know it, because the report from the gendarme was not classified. The report from the pilot was classified, but by then everybody knew about it, so it became known. There is nothing else to say about it. I mean, those things have been happening since the 50s. So, we have, it's great that Congress is now looking at those fuzzy black and white pictures that are not pictures, by the way. They are recordings of heat signatures, and everybody is treating it as if it was a picture. And again, we have, the technology here is completely fuzzy, and people are making up stories that scientists should not accept. And when is the last time science had to wait for a decision of Congress to study something? I mean, that's not the way a university works. You're doing some experiments. You in the course of those experiments, you discover the discrepancy. You study the discrepancy because it could lead to an invention or to a breakthrough or to a new theory of something. You have a patient in front of you who is dying of something that has not been recognized before. You document it. You don't call your congressman. So why are we spending all this time in Washington assuming that Congress is going to do science? This is not what we pay them for. This is not what Congress does.
That's a
Congress
fantastic
makes the
point, Jacques.
laws, and the laws may or may not have anything to do with science. So we're talking, they certainly have a role in this, which is very important, but we are misunderstanding the role of the legislator. It's a grave mistake. We should be in the lab inviting witnesses and working with them.
It's a fantastic point, Jacques, and it really affirms the value of research here. So I want to take another question from our members, a guy named Maximilian, who wants advice as a young researcher on what kind of technical expertise he might need, or I would also say academic expertise, and what the motivation would be to contribute meaningfully to UAP research. And I think we are asking you that question in light of the fact that you've emphasized that very strange, very weird, very embarrassing, very absurd data is part of the spectrum of data.
Well, he can look at the people who are doing this work now and see where they come from. None of us was trained at the university to work on UFOs. All of us, whether you're talking about Dr. Puthoff, Colm Keller, or Eric Davis, or others, we came to this out of other things we were doing. Now, in my case, I was a pretty good programmer and trained in astrophysics. So I had a job. Um, and I had a job at the University of Texas, and I had a job at Paris Observatory, and I had a job at Stanford. Um, and as part of that, I had access to computers, and I had access to people who could answer my questions about physics or about other things, and tell me where to go to find the information, and I would turn it into my interest in information science. And that's what I've done, but I've never been paid to do that. So my advice is get a good basic scientific education, find a place that you're passionate about, whether it's in medicine, in biology, in physics, or in any of the related areas. And then, um, you you have plenty of time. If you don't watch television, you have plenty of time to work on your own thing. Nobody's going to stop you. Then you don't need a security clearance, and you don't need to go to any of those places. You can just talk to people around you, and you'll find people who have had experiences, and you can begin to document them, and then you can begin to design your own, and you'll find other people like you, as we did, um, and you can build your own research field. And these days, thanks to Sol and other groups like that, you can publish, which wasn't true, you know, in in the old days. I can tell you, the Dr. Hynek, who was director of an observatory and head of a department of astronomy, uh, sent multiple case reports and case analyses to Science magazine and to other magazines where he could publish anything on astrophysics, but those things about UFOs, even though they were just as well or better documented, were never accepted. They were never published.
So, Jacques, following up on that, we continue to have a lot of great questions for our members, and I think this is a fantastic one because it tells us something about the limits of science, or science as it's usually practiced. Um, Someone, her name is Marianne, has asked a question about what the role of the artist is in understanding UAP, or the phenomenon. And I think that's a question that interests you as a writer and someone who appreciates aesthetic culture.
Well, the artists are there. I mean, they are in Hollywood. They've conveyed um, the impression of the witnesses, through film and drawings and cartoons, some wonderful cartoons about that have captured what we were saying before, the contradictions, the absurdity of, in many of those cartoons, the aliens are landing, and they are stupefied at something humans are doing, that creates a moment of humor. Humor is very, very important. So artists have been there. They have not done as much as they could do to capture the, very often what the witness is describing to me is graphic. It's an impression of an object, so they will describe the object and they will describe the conditions around the object. But obviously, they are struggling with words. were they describing colors that change all at the same time, with colors I've never seen before. Well, what's a color you've never seen before? So I think that is where, my ability to work with that discourse stops. This is where I would love to be there with an artist who can draw something and say, was it more like this or was it more like that? Ideally, somebody with a terminal or a computer where they could do some special effects, with different flashes and different things, and trying to reconstruct. Of course, we're never going to do it exactly, but we could try to reconstruct the environmental conditions that were there. And I think that's the role of the artist, which would be really, really important.
Well, I can imagine too, Jacques, that your own work as someone who's written literature, namely science fiction, you might think that the artist is also a source of imagination for scientific hypotheses or for insight into UAP.
Well, the uh, in my one of my science fiction novels in French was called Subspace, and it had to do. It earned the Johnson Prize in France, and it was about a group of students, of science students. I was a science student at the time, so it was easy for me to relate to what happened. And they were seeing little lights going through the wall of different colors and different frequencies. And they tried to study the lights and realized that the lights were conveying a message. I didn't want to use discs and so on because I didn't want to be, in a UFO book. And and they follow what the lights are telling them, and they get into a space which is the, the the title was subspace. So it goes into a space that has a different topology from our space, not just another planet, not just another universe with a similar thing, but another topology of space itself. So the spacecraft that they build gets distorted and gets encrusted with all kinds of things. And there was one, I did work with one artist who did the cover for the book. The cover for the book is the best thing about the book. I can tell you that his name is Forrest, Forest, and he is well known for another one of his works, which is Barbarella. The movie about Barbarella that all young men at the time were very excited about. And so he was a designer behind Barbarella.
Wow, wow, that's an amazing connection, Jacques. So, you told us earlier that your the personal subjective dimension to your research was so strong that you constructed an observation tower, not just to observe objects, but to provoke whatever's behind the objects, what you call the control system. So here's a question for you, coming again from one of our members whose name is Sue. And I think it's a difficult question to ask you publicly, but I still want to try it. Do you have any personal conclusions about UAP and why they're here?
Um, in science, you rarely reach. You, of course, you hope to reach a conclusion, but you're always aware that it's a temporary conclusion on the way to something else. And usually people ask me in a much more direct way, at your age, aren't you afraid that you're going to die without knowing what it is, which is a more direct way of asking the same question. Your, correspondent is very polite. Um, the um, I don't care. I mean, that's if you ask, Dr. Nolan, who has many discoveries to his credit, do you want to solve the problem of cancer? He probably would say, we've already made a lot of progress, and there are types of cancers that we can cure or detect early enough to cure. There are other types that we just don't understand at all. And the um, we will at some point, if as science makes progress. But any scientist has to expect to die without having all the answers. Um, I think that we relativity has given us a number of answers in physics, but we now find that that's insufficient to explain the contradictions that we have with quantum mechanics and so on, and the contradictions continue. And that's been the case for almost a century, that we haven't overcome the contradictions. So, yes, you make small advances, and once in a while you make a big advance. I think the important thing now, I mean, it's great that Congress is doing this work and so on, and I have a lot of respect for it, having been part of congressional hearings on other things, in the use of information networks for managing crises and so on, where I was asked to be part of the process of, as a technical witness. So I know how it works, and I have a lot of respect for that work. The in the lab, I'm not trying to evade the question. It's a big question. What I hope is to have a chance to explore the idea that we're dealing with a meta system, not just a system. And what we were designing with Mr. Bigelow was a meta system, an assembly of good observations that we could refine and then take up to the next level. And I think that's what is not being done. And that the people who are trained to be, the troops that would help us refine that system the project has been shut down for reasons I never understood. And the financing was terminated, and that's gone. It's evaporated. So I'm not going to jump into just hoping that this thing is going to happen again. I think those things happen rarely, that you can assemble the kind of talent that Dr. Colm Keller assembled with Mr. Bigelow, in the days of Bass, and the support we had from Washington at the time. It was very small, but I think that we were on the way to getting the right questions answered. So I would hope somebody would do it again. It's not going to be me. I would hope uh, to get some certainty about the nature of the dialogue with the phenomenon. What kind of dialogue is it? Is it just like a dialogue between us and a whale, for example, or an ape, or a bird, that we can develop? And there are a number of experiments to do that. There are experiments also on how you would communicate with aliens that have not been disclosed, but we know they exist. I know specifically that from people who were involved in those experiments that they exist, and I think that's a big hope for me that we can go forward to that and build the kind of language constructs that would enable us to tap into that higher level. I mean, we know there have to be higher levels of existence, and we know that they can communicate with us by sharing the space. I mean, we communicate with all kinds of with ants and mice that don't necessarily are not necessarily interested in a dialogue with us. But in in this case, it's going to be vital for us in terms of survival of humans to communicate in a way that's intelligent, even though we may be in some ways at lower levels from what we're perceiving. And I think that's what we need to come to grips with from certainly from what I can bring to the party, which is the information science and meta science side of it.
Well, Jacques, you just said something very interesting, and it speaks to a question that was on my mind. You've told me before that you think there's a real stake for humanity in understanding how to respond to the phenomenon. In that there's something in stake in trying to understand it. Um, and you just said something remarkable, which is that you think that this might have to do with human survival. So what did you mean by that? And what do you really think the stakes are for human beings in understanding the phenomenon?
We know from other work we've done and we've published, we know that the phenomenon has been with us for a long time, maybe as long as humans have been on the earth. And that, that raises a question of why do we see this concentration now? Well, now is the first time, now we're coming to a test. And astronomers have said, for many years, that in the evolution of a planet, in life evolving on a planet, we'll get to a point of discontinuity where it assembles technology to the point where it can destroy its own environment. And there are indications that maybe we haven't destroyed it, but we have committed a number of faulty decisions in our technical development and in our economic development that threaten our own existence on the planet. So people, including intellectuals, I think, make the mistake of saying you need to save the planet. Well, let me reassure you, the best thing, the that the only thing that would happen if we continue this way is that humans would disappear, but the planet wouldn't. I mean, the planet has seen many things, where 3 billion years of development, it has developed many, many forms of life that have disappeared for one reason or another, and it will continue. So if we exterminate ourselves by the stupid things we're doing to the environment, that's not a big problem for the Earth. I mean, the Earth will be without this form of life for a few centuries, and then something else will grow to replace us, and hopefully it will be better at survival. The issue we have here today is our survival. And that may be the reason of the increased intensity of a number of phenomena that are impinging on us now. Certainly the behavior of the phenomenon it's much more intense than it was in the 40s and 50s. Now, part of it is we're aware of it. Part of it is we have very good detection system that we didn't have before. And we now we go in space and we go everywhere fast. So we have more information, but I do think that the behavior is changing, that the interaction is getting more intense. And I think we have to pay attention to that because it may lead us to a transition. And I think more advanced races in the galaxy would would know that. They would know that life is rare, but there are so many opportunities for planets to develop that there must be life throughout the galaxy in different places. The question is, does it succeed in growing beyond the stage where we are now in the 21st century, where we can in fact destroy life? Okay? Before we couldn't. I mean, we could kill lots of people, and we have, for all kinds of reasons. But the we couldn't eliminate advanced life. You know, rats were there millennia before humans developed, and they are still doing the same thing that they did, you know, 10,000 years ago, and they probably will survive because they're underground and they're, able to adapt in incredible intelligence to their environment. They haven't developed science, but under the right conditions, who knows?
Jacques, that's a remarkable answer, and it's very unfortunate we don't have more time because you just said a number of profound things that show us that the UAP problem is related to other problems, including one of an existential nature for us that have a lot to do with our ethical and social and political development. So thank you for closing with that. It's appreciated, and I have to say this is a remarkable interview because I think that in a very short span of time we were able to glean a great deal of insight from your comments, and you packed your wisdom into a small span of time. So thank
Thank
you,
you
Jacques.
to all the people who at Sol who ask the questions. I think we're in a field where the questions are more important than the answers right now. We have to come up with new questions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The questions are more important than the answers. So thank you, Jacques, and thanks to the audience for being here.
Thank you.